said, welcome to this event hosted by Enfield and Barnets UNA in partnership with Enfield Climate Action Forum. Enfield and Barnets is the local group of UNA UK, and UNA UK exists to support and promote the work of the UN at a regional and local level. We are part of the London and South East region, which is very active with a range of events, talks and activities. Locally, we host occasional talks such as this evening. We also have a bi-monthly book club which considers non-fiction work relating to all aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals, and a more informal bi-monthly discussion group on local issues and news, as well as UN issues. As Ali has already said, Bill Linton's email address is in the chat box, and he will be very happy to hear from you if you are interested in joining us. As the world remains distracted by the awful events in the Ukraine and other recent news, it is important to remember that climate change and the issues it generates for our planet and people, both now and for future generations, is an ongoing news item which needs to be addressed and monitored, and on which we need to be informed and stay focused so that the good work to date is not lost or rescinded. We are planning a future talk on how the UN stage continues to be used for brinkmanship and how this impacts on the goal of global peace. Tonight's session was arranged before the war in Ukraine, and we feel that the global events within which it sits warrant a session by themselves. Tonight's session, though, will start us off, and we are therefore extremely grateful to our speaker for bringing us up to date on the most recent COP talks. So, Professor Durrani, over to you.
What I'm going to do is really to talk about what I learned by being able to attend COP26 as a delegate. Not only was it in my home city of Glasgow, but I was representing an international organization of engineers called the IEEE. So I had the good fortune of attending a number of sessions, but more importantly, also to present a workshop on climate change and technological aspects of it. But these particular set of slides that I'm going to show you really are to do with giving some background to COP26. Where do we stand with regards to climate change? What were the specific issues that were debated and discussed and agreed at COP26? And then I'll give you a little bit of a flavor of what has been happening since COP26. So first of all, the whole question arises, and it really comes back to the issue of how long have we been known about climate change? And there are also some interesting guests, but what I tried to do was identify specific moments in our history where the issue of climate change has come up. So for example, John Tyndall, as long ago as 1859, he did research on heat of various gases in our atmosphere. And he noted that water vapor was by far the most powerful absorber of radiant heat. Other gases were seen as having a negligible effect. Following on from him, Arrhenius essentially was the first person to predict that emissions of carbon dioxide from burning of fossil fuels and other combustible processes were large enough to cause global warming. And this was in 1896. And he even predicted that any doubling of the percentage of carbon dioxide in the air would raise the temperature of the Earth's surface by 4 degrees. Very prescient indeed. I seem to be frozen here. Oh, sorry, let's go back. And in 1927, Alexander Graham Bell, I particularly included him because the organization I was represented at COP26 was the IEEE, which has to do with electronic engineering. But he made the comment that unchecked burning of fossil fuels would have a sort of greenhouse effect, and the net result is greenhouse will become a hothouse. Now, the key thing really is that paleoclimatologists have been studying the whole issue of weather and climate over a period of time, and they've been using a whole set of interesting tools to try to identify the changes in the weather and changes in the climate over a period of time. And what they've been using is primarily ice sheets which trap gases and chemical composition of water, which allows the scientists to recreate past temperatures. Essentially, they look at ice cores from the Antarctic and elsewhere to study tree rings, most of it, but most importantly, it is really the ice cores at certain specific areas. For example, in the Antarctica, something called the Vostok ice core is very important. It stretches back to 800 years. And over there in the bottom slide, you see dark and white layers representing different regions and different areas of temperature changes historically. Now, let me move on to the next slide. For some reason, my movement is getting trapped here. Oh, that's better. Now, this is an interesting slide which uses study of the ice core over close to 800 years. And it indicates that for the past 800 years, roughly the carbon dioxide content has not exceeded 400 parts per million. It's only very recently, since the Industrial Revolution, that the content of carbon dioxide, which is one of the key greenhouse gases, has really shot up. And as you can see, it has far exceeded what has happened in the past. And all this was really obtained by analyzing the ice cores and looking at the tiny bubbles that are trapped in the ice, both chemically and physically, to try to map out these temperature profiles. This next slide is an interesting one. It tracks global temperatures from roughly 1850 through to now. The wavy blue line really indicates the changes in temperature due to natural factors, whereas the red line and the dots, particularly the red line, is a trend which shows really the effect of human activity. And when you combine the two, the gray line is the combination of human activity and natural factors. And it very clearly illustrates that over the last 100 or so years, global temperatures have been rising and rising quite significantly. I just wanted to bring these to your attention to primarily highlight that the greenhouse gases have had a physical effect on our climate, and more importantly, it is man-made. Ipcc is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was its fifth assessment report of 2014 that really triggered but they have been talking about climate change over a period of time, but this was the report that made a major impact on COP, I think 24, which was held in Paris, and significant commitments were made then. The point to make over here is that warming of climate change is unequivocal and is observed, and the observed changes are unprecedented over the decades of millennia. It is extremely likely, bearing in mind IPCC consists of 200 statisticians, so they tend to be giving caveats on what statements they make. But it's extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of this warming since the mid-20th century. The impact of warming are already underway, but we do have the means to limit climate change and have a sustainable, prosperous future. It was this last bit that became an important point of discussion during COP26. An interesting point that was made is climate is what you expect, weather is what you get. Weather is what happens on a day-to-day basis to temperature changes and things, whereas climate really looks at overall trends. Now, I'm going to give you a very quick summary of the UN Climate Change Conference that was held in Glasgow. It was quite an event. There were over 36,000 participants, including 200 heads of state. There was enormous security, but then there were several parallel sessions. Each one of them was as good as the other. And there were two different sites for it. One was called the UN side, and the other was the UK side. The UN side consisted of delegates and dignitaries from all over the world debating and discussing things, whereas the UK side was where climate change activists were able to attend and display and protest and make statements that you would have seen in part of the headlines. This is the site of the conference. Everything in white was constructed very specifically for that conference. This is a huge site on the river Clyde, and different areas were dedicated for different things. And I'm just going to show some of these to you, just to give you a flavor of what the event looked like. There was enormous security, and this was primarily a rush of people wanting to enter the premises. And in some cases, it took up to 2 hours of queuing, because not only was there heavy security, there were banks of X-ray machines where you had to put your bags in, you had to give physical checkups. So that was the only disappointing feature of this particular conference, the sheer delays in getting in. But once you got in, it really was worth it. This was just an ambiance of some of the different exhibits that were made over there. Just a huge area that was devoted primarily for people to mix up and meet and chat to each other. This is an example of a hydrogen-driven car. I think this is the first in the world that a small company called River Simple, that had put together this hydrogen-driven car, and they brought it along, and it really was the hit of the place. There was another one that was developed by Envision, the racing company, and again, they made all sorts of interesting comments about the car being able to run on hydrogen over a period of time. These are some of the various halls. There were, I think, about 15 different halls that people could meet and discuss, and the media was present. You may have seen this thing in some of the clips that were shown on the conference. There were a huge number of dignitaries. Mr. Kerry, who was the USA's presidential delegate on climate change, he was there, and he gave quite a moving speech. In addition to that, Mr. President Obama came along the second day, and he spoke for pretty close to an hour without any notes whatsoever. It was really a really impressive presentation. Again, he gave the message that clearly climate change is for all of us. And he was particularly addressing the younger members of the audience as to what they should be doing. Now I'm going to come down to give you some details of what the event was all about and what were the decisions that were taken. So it was primarily to bring together heads of states and climate experts to agree some coordinated actions to tackle climate change. Since UK was the host country, Mr. Alok Sharma was appointed the president of the conference, and he did a lot of pre-conference work going around the world, meeting delegates from all different countries to try to drum up support for certain decisions that could be taken. One of the areas that was agreed upon is something called nationally declared energy contributions. Every country had to commit itself to these energy contributions to essentially contribute towards suppressing greenhouse gas emissions. The aim was to agree to measures to accelerate the move to net zero carbon emissions globally, help countries to prepare for the impact of climate change. There was a great deal of interest in developing the green industry, mobilize finance, bankers, investors, and asset managers. And the whole objective was that 197 countries that were present there, representing UN in the large, would agree to the measures. I'm going to show you a few slides as to what agreements were reached and what weren't. But this is just a slide that shows one of the reasons why there is this debate about energy consumption, where we really rely upon 33% of oil, 27% of coal, almost, and 24% of gas, and only 15% of our energy consumption is based upon renewables or nuclear. So we have a long way to go. I think it's either my internet or Ali, can you hear me?
Yes, Tariq, I think you have picked up the pen symbol, which implies it's gone into edit mode. Bottom left-hand corner.
You're right. You're right. We're moving. Okay, there's certain clearly issues that were there. What was agreed at the US and China cooperated on working together to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C, particularly issues related to methane emission, transition to energy, and decarbonization. However, at least at COP26, there wasn't anything very specific available as to what was meant by this cooperation. You'd have heard there's a lot of discussion about coal. More than 40 countries, including 23 new ones, pledged to phase out coal, including heavy coal users such as Poland, Ukraine, and Vietnam. So major countries are willing to phase out coal by 2030, poor countries by 2040. However, some of the key players such as Australia, China, US, and India did not agree to this wording of phasing out. What they said was we will be phasing down coal power and subsidies. I understand that India suggested that it would be in a position of becoming carbon neutral by the year 2070, a 50-year span. An important aspect of COP26 was this whole issue of agreement on deforestation. So more than 130 world leaders promised to end and reverse deforestation by 2030, and they're allocating 19.2 billion towards that. What deforestation implies is to remove land permanently from forestry for agricultural purposes, but it excludes traditional logging. Beef production is the top driver for deforestation in the world's tropical forests, and twice the impact on the production of soya samples, soya and palm oil and wood products. However, agreements on forestry have a poor record of implementation. And the whole issue really was how much of this 19.2 billion that has been promised would be to tear down indigenous forests to build plantations. One of the things that UK was very proud about was this agreement on methane. Currently, atmospheric methane has caused 30% of global warming since 2007 due to fracking and other industrial processes. The US and EU announced at the conference a global partnership to cut emissions of greenhouse methane by 30%. China, Russia, and India did not participate. The hope really is that the new set of satellites that the European Space Agency has put out will be used for surveillance to help monitor emissions. An interesting alliance called BOGA, Beyond Oil and Gas, which was led by Denmark and Costa Rica, commits 12 smaller countries to date to end oil and gas use and halt new license for exploration. However, there was no agreement by the big oil producers such as Russia, Saudi Arabia, US, and even UK. Farming, agriculture, and food featured less prominently at the summit, despite an analysis released by UFAO at COP26 showing that emissions from food systems have increased by 17% over the past 3 decades. 45 countries pledged urgent action on making farming more sustainable and investing in green agricultural practices. The Clyde Bank Declaration, as it was called with regards to shipping, commits 22 countries to create at least 6 zero-emission maritime routes by 2025 with low access to carbon fuels. The issue of petrol and gases was of great concern, and in theory, a total of 34 countries, cities, car manufacturers, and final institutions committed themselves to stopping the sale of non-electric vehicles by 2040. This does not include USA, Germany, or China, and it does not include the key petrol engine manufacturers such as Volkswagen, Toyota, Renault, Nissan, or BMW. Again, investment finance, there was a lot of talk about lining up industrial organizations to make specific commitments. And the UK government announced that financial firms controlling about 40% of global assets, which is $130 trillion worth, are willing to submit net zero goals by 2050. There was a great deal of concern about the rather haphazard way in which carbon trading rules have evolved, clarity and standardization of international carbon trading practices. The voluntary market for offsetting is worth about 100 billion, but it is, as I said, very haphazard. Financial help for poor countries. In principle, 100 billion was promised to support poor countries to adapt to climate change and make the transition to clean energy to be met by 2023. Remember, these are promises. Whether they actually happen is a different issue. Loss and damage not agreed. Poorer countries have been calling for funding loss and damage that richer countries could compensate poorer ones for today's climate change. Nothing was agreed on that. Fossil fuel subsidies. All countries signed off a pact calling for an end to fossil fuel subsidies. By when? That's a question mark. The G20 nations spent 600 billion subsidizing fossil fuels last year. Now, this slide just indicates to you that although there has been a pledge made of 100 billion per year, it's essentially a goal to be achieved. It has been going on gradually increasing from year to year, and the goal is 100 billion by 2020. An estimate of cost of adapting climate change in the developing world is 300 billion a year by 2030 and 500 billion by 2050. So these figures do pale into insignificance. This is an interesting slide, which is able to get out of the energy policy tracker, which shows how energy industry is being subsidized throughout the world. The orange bars indicate fossil fuel subsidies, whereas the gray bar indicates subsidies for clean energy. As you can see, in the US for 2020, the subsidy for fossil fuels was well over $70 billion as compared to 25 billion in clean energy. In the UK, we're subsidizing fossil fuel to about 42 billion as compared to about 25 billion in renewable energy. Again, so what was agreed? Technical issues. The COP resolved several outstanding technical issues, including how countries monitor and report their emissions. Emissions can be verified independently by satellite observations. The Glasgow Climate Pact, it ratcheted up emission cutting plans in COP27 and each year thereafter. Persuade developing countries to deliver higher levels of climate finance for mitigation, adaptation, and loss, and provide greater scrutiny and comparison of individual country emissions. The innovation is, this was the EU Catalyst program that was launched worth $1 billion to finance climate innovation alongside Bill Gates Foundation and the European Investment Bank. And the EU Catalyst really would be embedded within the Horizon 2020 and beyond. So where are we? A 2.4 degrees temperature rise is likely based on submitted NDCs. Will it happen? Big question. So summary, compared with previous COPs, good progress has been made in reducing projected temperatures from 2.7 to 2.4 based on nationally determined contributions. COP26 has built a common purpose for mitigation, adaptation, and finance. Countries have made compromises for sake of global agreement. Our island nations remain under major threat. With the rise in global temperatures and the rise of ocean levels, there's a huge threat to them. Assistance to developing countries needs to grow well beyond the 100 billion. Loss and damage to poor countries for historical emissions has not been agreed. I don't think it will be. The chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C is very low. Major progress is needed to limit warming to 2 degrees C. The hope really is that at COP27, it will be held in Egypt, there may be some indications of how we are progressing in that direction. The current estimated temperature rise of 2.4 degrees C by 2100 has severe long-term impact. What I wanted to do just post COP26, things haven't just stopped there. There have been a number of developments, and I'll just bring some of these to your attention. These are pledges rather than developments. So in March 2022, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is an intergovernmental organization for economic organization with 38 member countries, agreed to a certain declaration to support climate change. They agreed to curb biodiversity, address plastics pollution, align finance and environmental objectives, accelerate climate change actions to keep temperature rise within 1.5 degrees C, rise within reach, sorry. Excuse me. The hope is that they will develop effective environmental and climate strategies aimed at achieving net zero gas emissions by 2050. Strengthening efforts to align COVID-19 recovery plans with climate goals to build a green, inclusive, and resilient recovery for all. Develop a comprehensive life cycle approach to tackle plastics pollution. Develop legally binding instruments on plastic pollution. As an aside, global plastics pollution has doubled from 2000 to 2019 to something of the order of 353 million tons. And this is available everywhere, whether it's land, coastal regions, the ocean. So plastics is a huge menace for us. I'm just going to show this last slide because the Ipcc, the Intergovernmental Committee on Panel on Climate Change, has brought out its recent report. Remember, the fifth report impacted on the COP, which was held in Paris, and a number of agreements were achieved there. This has just come out last month, and it provides an update on the global assessment of climate change, mitigation, and pledges and examines the sources of global emissions. It explains development and emission reduction and mitigation efforts, assessing the impact of national climate pledges. The final point that was being made was that climate change is a grave and mounting threat to our well-being and a healthy planet. Our actions today will shape how people adapt. According to the report, greenhouse gas emissions have continued to rise during the period 2010 to 2019. That has had a cumulative net carbon dioxide emissions since 1850. Average annual GHG emissions during 2010 to 2019 were higher than any period in any previous decade. But the growth between 2010 to 19 was lower than between 2000 and 2009. So at least there is some optimism here. Net zero carbon dioxide emissions from industrial sector are challenging, but not impossible. I should have said impossible. Progressing towards net zero from industry will be enabled by the adoption of new production processes using low and zero greenhouse gas, electricity, hydrogen, fuels, and carbon management. The first sentence is important here because it actually gives us some physical handle to what is being talked about. Mitigation options costing USD $100 could reduce global greenhouse emission by at least a half of the 2019 level by 2030. So, but we have to be able to be committed to do these things. Global GDP continues to grow in model pathways, but without accounting for the economic benefits of mitigation action from avoided damages for climate change or from reduced adaptation costs. It is a few percent lower in 2050 compared to pathways without mitigation beyond current policies. The global economic benefit of limiting warming to 2 degrees is reported to exceed the cost of mitigation in most of the assessed literature. So the investment will pay off.
Thank you very much, Tariq. An insightful overview of what was covered by COP26.